Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to another edition of FAM's Heart to Heart series. My name is Kevin Ring. I'm president of FAM. Today, we're going to talk about one of the topics that's nearest and dearest to my heart, and I know to a lot of our members, and that's oversight of state and federal prisons. This issue has always been important. This oversight's always been needed, and I think the COVID crisis has exposed that even more than ever. And we couldn't have two better guests to talk about this topic. So I'm really grateful that they've given their time to join us. The first is Representative Karen Bass, who's in her 5th term, representing the 37th District of California. She's done a lot. I'm gonna have her talk about some of her background. She's been working on these issues even before she got to Congress. But of most relevance is she's currently chair of the House Subcommittee on Crime, Terrorism, and Homeland Security. We're also grateful that Joanna Carnes is able to join us. Joanna has been working on prison oversight for a number of years as well, and she is the newly established director of the Washington State's Office of Corrections Ombuds Office, which is something I would love to see in all 50 state offices, 50 states. And so I'm dying to get into that topic, but as so often has happened lately, we are superseded by news stories that demand our attention. And that is the case with the killing of George Floyd in Minnesota. And so I thought it'd be crazy to not address that. And instead of listening to me talk about it, I really wanted to hear from Representative Bass and get your thoughts on how we make sense of this. And how do you see this fitting into a larger problem that's either society's problem or the criminal justice system's problem? Just how do people make sense of this?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to participate. I have to tell you that I have followed FAM from the beginning, really, and I just so admire the work of the organization. And you should know that the reason I wanted to run for Congress and run for office, period, is to address criminal justice reform. I've been involved in this issue, as you mentioned, for a long time, in the 80s, watching the laws be passed that I knew was going to lead to mass incarceration. It has been a passion of mine ever since, because it is such an extreme example of a contradiction in the United States and everything we're supposed to be about. So when I saw the public execution, because that is what it was a public lynching, that's what came to mind to me. He wasn't strung up on a tree. But in the days when lynching was very common, a very common form of terrorism used against Black people, they even advertised it, and they were social events. They said, come out, have a picnic, and watch us burn a human being alive. To me, that's what I saw, watching him being executed on TV. That's what I saw when I saw the young man jogging. That's what I thought when I heard about the young woman who was killed in her bedroom. In the midst of the pandemic, where there is an extreme disproportionate death rate of African Americans, to know that 85% of the people who were cited for not wearing their mask in New York were either Black or brown. And you see white folks gathering by the hundreds and no one says anything. It just leaves you so full, wondering when in America, when in America will it actually stop? So thank you so much for inviting me to be here with you. And the way it feels right now is there's a wholesale assault on Black folks, whether it's from a virus that you're not going to be treated with, or whether you're going to have to worry about being gunned down in the streets.
Yeah, well, that's poignant, and thank you for sharing that. It's hard for people to watch, and I wonder if this is one of those things that, especially for a lot of white Americans, including myself, that we benefit from the aid of cell phones and videos, because I think in a lot of communities, right? In a lot of communities, this has been happening, and you didn't believe us when we said Black Lives Matter. You didn't think this was happening, and now we can show you this.
But the problem with that is that people will still say, well, I don't know what was happening before.
Yeah.
As though, let's just say he did commit a crime. Does that mean he should be executed on the streets? Right. What happened to a trial? What happened to all of that? It's okay to execute. Or the young man that was shot while jogging, they show videos of him going into a building. Does that mean that he deserved to be hunted?
Yeah, I think we have a strong victim blaming, sort of impulse. And I think it's even more so when the victim is African American. So I think that's part of what happens here. I want to talk, actually, why don't I have Joanna introduce yourself and talk about your role in Washington State, and then I'm going to start getting into some questions. But like I said, to me, I wrote an op-ed about this in The Hill. You're the gold standard. I know you've been working on this a long time. I just think, actually, let me tie these things two together. A lot of time, the reason I think that we have these problems in our prisons and in our police is because you have a bad culture that develops, and then there's no oversight. And so we know that power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And if you're not watched, people get away with what they can get away with, and the darker impulses are fed. And so just as with police forces, which is not our specialty, oversight, but with prisons, and again, cell phones helping us in a lot of cases, showing us what's going on behind closed doors because people aren't allowed there. We need independent oversight. So talk about, sort of your history with that issue and your current role, if you could.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think that there is a great segue here, or tying together of these two, because as we're seeing, having that access to the cameras has made such a difference in moving public opinion, moving legislators to take action. And in prisons, that is often exactly what you don't have. They often do not release, first of all, do they have cameras? Do they have them in all the areas? And then second of all, do they release that camera footage to any outside party? Here in Washington, for example, they do not release it for security reasons. Now, I have access to it, and so that leads to the importance of the role that I have. But just thinking about the ways that camera footage has led to so much change, I think certainly there's a call to action, I think, within the prison system and within state legislatures to ensure that there is that footage available to the public and to the legislature for that appropriate oversight. So, to go back to your original question, just to introduce myself briefly, I've been involved in correctional oversight for about 15 years now. I spent 6 years as the director of the Correctional Institution Inspection Committee, which is a legislative oversight committee in Ohio. And now, as you said, I'm the director of the Office of the Corrections Ombuds in the state of Washington, which actually I report directly to Governor Inslee. And the role that we have here is to receive and resolve and investigate and put out public reports on complaints related to the health, safety, welfare, and rights of incarcerated people. And so turning back to the COVID-19 issue, I definitely, the role again that we play, the access that we have to the inside of these closed facilities, when right now visitation is shut down, volunteer programs are shut down. But my office, at the request of the community, and I'll be honest, at first I was very leery of going into the facilities due to the potential transmission of the disease. But the community really pushed for us to go in, and we've been doing these monitoring visits inside the facilities. And I have seen change happen, when we go in and document and take pictures and say, this is a concern. The prison system has responded to address those issues. So it has been very important in this time of COVID-19, and it comes with having the authority vested in a public state office, like what I have.
Yeah, well, I want to dig into that more, but I should have said this at the beginning. Representative Bass, just on behalf of everyone at FAM, thank you for what you're doing in this crisis, because you have reached out early and said, I think we're not thinking about the people behind bars. And so early on, I know you've had some convenings, both under the auspices of the Black Caucus, but your office has been, has reached out to us and other advocates, because I do think this is a group that's being forgotten. I note on the news that people are talking about the second wave, and for a lot of people in the prison, they're still dealing with the first wave.
Right.
And so I want to thank you for, I know you've written to the Justice Department, you've called on BOP to make changes, to implement reforms to get people out faster, to use the authorities they have. What has been your take on the response from the BOP during this COVID crisis?
Well, actually, I have to rely on you guys to tell me the response. You know what I mean? Because when I talk to BOP, it's great. But, the proof is in the pudding. And I do think that some of the institutions are in an impossible situation. So, and I appreciate, Joanna, what you were saying. That's encouraging to me because next week I'm going to visit Terminal Island, which is the prison in the Southern California that, well, actually, I think a couple of weeks ago, they said they had the widest, spread in terms of infections. And so I'm going to see them next week. I talked to the warden yesterday. She seemed genuinely overwhelmed and was concerned about several of the things that had fallen through the cracks with an individual I was inquiring about. And so I am going in next week, and I'm going in from the perspective of, you're in an impossible situation. What can I do to be helpful? So it might be that you two offer Janice Bashford some specific thoughts that I can take in with me. So I'm encouraged by that. But I know that the release has not happened in the ways that we wanted. I listened to the families and heard people getting all kinds of crazy information, very inconsistent. I am personally concerned that people be tested and treated before they leave, because the very communities they're coming to are the communities that are dealing with the disproportionate death rate. But how that is done is very important. I don't want that to be used as a reason not to let people out. And I have a very specific example, which was why I called the warden yesterday. There was a young man that was supposed to have gotten out on Tuesday. They decided that they were going to hold him for 2 more weeks. They were going to isolate him, but they should have isolated him when he had a release date. And so his mother shows up to pick him up. Nobody called her in advance. And so it's those kind of things, I think that we have to keep the pressure on, but I also think, because I don't want it to go the other way, meaning I don't want them to just stop cooperating. I mean, we're dealing with an administration that doesn't believe in following the law. So we have to be careful how we deal with this. We don't want to have a backlash from them and then they not let anybody out. So those are some of the things that I want to continue focusing on. How do we help them get to the point of being consistent? But then to me, as important, we have to put money in reentry services, because I don't want people getting out and having nowhere to go, nothing to do. We have to focus on removing the barriers that happen with people that are formerly incarcerated, not being able to apply for TANF, not being able to apply for food stamps, not being able to get in public housing. So our legislation has called for relaxing of all of that, a lot of money into reentry services and other services to help people when they get out.
Yeah, no, that's important. And I know that every family member who's watching is glad that you're going to visit, because we just feel like, we had a hashtag visit a prison campaign where we're trying to get lawmakers to visit a prison. And then, even sometimes when they did that, we know they're getting sort of a dog and pony show. I know that's not what you're going to get at Terminal Island because you won't allow it, but it is really important to go and see these facilities for for yourself, and not just get the guided tour, but talk to the people who are there, both staff and residents. And so thank you for doing that. Terminal Island is a big concern for a lot of our families. There was just a death there, somebody who was recovered and then got it again and now just passed. And so there's a lot of concern about that place in particular. I want to just talk, from our perspective, in the federal system, there's 170,000 people in federal prison, and their families during this COVID crisis are obviously scared to death. And so there's 2 aspects of oversight that I think people think of one and not the other. And one is just inspection of facilities, having the right, as Joanna mentioned, that she can go in and see these things for herself. She gets the video footage and things like that. The other one is sort of almost a customer service for families, which is their loved ones get moved to places that they don't know. They're in the SHU. They don't hear them for 2 weeks. I'm sorry, solitary confinement, I should say.
No.
COVID has exacerbated that. We have a number of stories. We shouldn't have any, but we have a number of stories where people are finding out their loved one is on a ventilator, and they want to know if the family wants to sign a DNR order. This is the first time they're hearing from the prison. So these are things that just shouldn't happen. And I agree with you, Representative Bass, that I think the system's overloaded. They may not be ready for this. but I'm also concerned we're not going to get any lessons learned if we don't say, what happened here. And so I want to, we have first step implementation, we have COVID. Now there's this new thing where they're using the risk assessment score. They've changed how they're implementing it in a way that is limiting the number of people that can possibly get out. I mean, you're chairwoman of the crime subcommittee, and you're not getting answers, I feel like, and you're right, we try to supply as much information because we hear from families, but it has always frustrated me both at the state and federal level that lawmakers can't even get answers from these agencies.
Well, no, you're absolutely right. And again, put it in the context of this administration where, they have essentially been told not to talk to Democratic lawmakers. So the fact that we even get a return call from BOP, that's why I said I want to handle it carefully, because I don't want them to just shut down like they've done with the immigration detention centers where lawmakers can't even go in. But you know what I think that we should do, because I'm always looking for practical things. I think that as you gather the stories, you should let us know, because then I can go to those lawmakers and say, can you help in this specific facility? Can you go visit this specific facility? Can you help get this particular person out? After our calls, a couple of the people were able to get out. And I've been doing that kind of on a case-by-case basis. Now, you and I mean, we all know that's not the way it should happen. We know that. But, let's do all of the above, meaning fight for legislation, fight for oversight, fight for resources, and fight for individual cases.
Yeah, and let me just say, let's be very specific. Because of a call that you helped arrange with the speaker, I know that intervention was taken on behalf. I'm sure there's a man named John Lewis who's watching this broadcast. His wife is supposed to be home in a couple of days. And
we are so excited.
And so we're grateful for that. And it does. Some of this is individual. At FAM, we're the same way. Like, we're helping in individual stories and people, but we're trying to make systemic change. And, we had on the program just a couple weeks ago, Clara LeBeau, whose granddaughter was Andrea Circlebearer, the 30-year-old woman who died. And what I worry about in cases like that, and Mandy Richards, whose brother died in prison, and we've had a whole host of these, is there's never any accountability. The news cycle moves on, and then there just seems to be no one goes at BOP and says, it doesn't have to be hostile. It's just like, how did this happen? In Andrea's case, who made that decision to fly her from South Dakota to Texas, 1,000 miles away, 8 months pregnant? Like, again, it doesn't have to be people fired or whatever. It's just like, what broke down in the system that allowed that to happen? And I think those are questions that only members of Congress can get at, or, an independent oversight body can. But like you said, you're stymied in so many ways because of an administration that doesn't want to cooperate.
Right, exactly. And so I think that we have to come up with a pretty comprehensive, approach, but continue doing what we're doing in terms of pushing this. I mean, again, fighting for a systemic change is something that, is absolutely necessary, but fighting the individual battles, are as well. And I think in a lot of times there is no explanation. It's just basic incompetence. I asked the warden, why didn't you tell this mother? You knew a week ago that he wasn't getting out. Why didn't you tell her? Why put her through that emotional trauma? And she apologized and she said, it was our mistake. It was our mistake. So she didn't react offensively, and she could have. And she welcomed me to come. And so, I'm going to do that. I definitely am.
Well, that's smart. And I agree with you. A lot of times it wasn't somebody's job, or, we don't communicate with the families. We don't tell them this sort of stuff. I just want to mention, I'm going to ask Joanna a question, but Diana Cabrera, who's one of our most active members, said, thank you for visiting Terminal Island. Her husband is there and he's supposed to be coming home soon.
Well, she needs to give me his information.
Okay.
She needs to give me his information and let me ask about it. Okay. And see, and see where he is.
Because, one thing you said was about just sort of the bureaucracy and the implementation. There has been so many fits and starts of, people were sent to quarantine, you're going to go home, and then they were pulled out. And it's just this zigging and zagging. And yes, it's hurtful at any time, but during a pandemic where you're concerned about your loved one's life and you're not getting information and no one tells you why you were, were approved and then revoked. That's heartbreaking.
Oh, I just can't even imagine that, because I know that the families are just sitting there terrified that their relatives are going to get sick, and how could they not? Now, I do want to say that one of the things that's very frustrating about the news that might be something we can all address is they do report on the subject. Rachel Maddow's great. She'll report on it, but there's never a solution. It's just, this is what is going on. And so we need to jump in the press and talk about the solutions, which is early release. I mean, I personally, in the first bill, wanted to require mandatory testing of everyone, the people that work there, the people that are there, and that they should be treated, because otherwise, I mean, you're just killing people. That's how we're going to reduce the prison population. And I just think that's beyond horrific.
Yeah. And it's always been so, to us, it's been, we're closing businesses at gunpoint. We're making all these incredible changes on the outside, but prisons, we do almost nothing. They're lucky to have soap in some cases. It's
right. Well, I listened to one of my colleagues yesterday complain that in California, we're trying to get rid of bail, and by not keeping people on bail. And I think that we have to take advantage of this time period, because obviously that there is no reason in the world for people to be in jail because of bail. But it is also an opportunity for us to say, after this is over, aha, all those people that were released, guess what? They showed up for court when they were needed to. So it raises those questions. But then you have the prison in Arizona where the prison sued because they didn't have enough inmates. I'm sure you saw that. The private prison, they were mad.
Yeah. No, and I'm with you on hoping that there's some lessons learned from this. And look, even at the federal level, if we send 3,000 to 5,000 people to home confinement and find out there were no problems, which I think we are, that should be the new normal. These people shouldn't have been there anyway. Joanne, I want to ask you about, what have you seen as successes and sort of challenges? Because there's always critics, and I've heard people even say in Washington State that I'm sure you're not staffed as much as you want to. I'm sure you don't get all the cooperation you want to. So what lessons can be drawn, both good and bad? I saw your annual report you issued at the end of last year, and I was so encouraged by it, which is why I wrote that piece, because you address things like medical problems, which so many of our families, their loved ones in the federal system and other states, there's no medical care. They don't know how to, So what do you say about successes, and what things do you think, if you were starting from scratch again or advising another system, you'd do?
Well, first, I want to make sure I take the opportunity, since this is Families Against Mandatory Minimums, to thank the family members who are really the driving force to create this office. So even though I'm now the director of it, I was not the driving force to create it. It was the family members and the advocates and the coalition that they built that made this happen. So I just want to first give encouragement to everyone that it is possible. It's your work. It's the people speaking that made this happen. So to the challenges and the successes, of course, as with any new office, building it and staffing it and creating all the protocols, that's a challenge. The successes that I see so far in healthcare, we've really been highlighting the problems that we've been seeing. And even, again, another tie into your conversation that you just had, it's often silos that happen, information that's not shared. Someone makes a decision that is just maybe the wrong call at the wrong time, but they're just following their protocol. And it's all those things. It's human error and bureaucracy and red tape, all of those things that ultimately can result in really tragic outcomes for people. And so the benefit of this office is producing these reports and actually getting these people in the room to say medical, classification, custody. Let's come together and think about why this happened, had this outcome for this individual, and why it didn't need to go that way. And I'm thinking of a couple cases that where someone, for example, was delayed in his transfer to receive cancer care. And due to that delay, he ultimately was, unfortunately, ultimately deemed to be too far past the point that he could not receive the cancer care by the time he transferred. And then ultimately he did pass away. And so it's things like that, that it wasn't an individual medical decision to say we're not giving him care. It was the confluence of these different departments that resulted in that. So that's been a success, to bring these things together, to bring the people in the room to get outcomes. The harder part is really then to actually implement on DOC's part the recommendations. Even when they agree to it, implementing all of these changes, I think, is really a challenge, especially if you have a department that isn't, that oversight is new, and having this external look over their shoulder is new. There's just a huge sea change that has to happen in their culture to be able to work well with oversight and make it a productive, positive, and outcome-driven experience, as opposed to just antagonistic.
Well, and I think that's always a challenge, which is, and I was going to ask you that, is, how is that received by corrections officers and staff who work in the facilities? Because I don't see oversight. I really don't. People don't believe this. I don't see this as a threat to them. I see everybody who works in these environments benefiting from greater oversight. I think we've seen that in COVID. You have corrections officers who don't want to get sick any more than the people who are incarcerated. So, how has that been? Is there a tension? Is it, oh, you're looking to get me in trouble? Or how has that gone?
Yeah, I think it's the same here in Washington that you would find other places. We have staff who call my office and say, I have this concern, can you look into this? And thank you for writing this report and addressing these issues. And a large number of staff are so thankful to have this outside body, because they themselves are trapped in the same bureaucracy that makes it that change cannot happen for them. But then, of course, you do have, every time I do a feedback from staff, even I did a survey of disciplinary hearing officers, and that was actually one of the responses, was that the incarcerated will just make a threat that they're going to call the ombuds and get this overturned, and then it does happen, and how this is a bad thing. But I try to spread the gospel, as you just mentioned, that what we're doing is just seeing if you're following policy. If you're following policy and protocol, then we're not overturning your case, or we're not negatively impacting you. But if you are not following policy and protocol, then we will be bringing that to the attention of the people who need to make the change. So anyone who is interested in making sure that staff are doing the right thing, which all staff should be, it should not be a threat to them. It should be perceived as a benefit.
Yeah, and one of the chief reasons I am so strongly in favor of oversight is because for families, they worry about retaliation against their loved one if they make complaints. And you're both nodding because it is an issue that comes up. And sometimes it may not be true, but the fear is real. And I know it does happen in some cases. And I would say, Representative Bass, when people call us, without a BOP oversight office or something like that, a lot of times we'll say, you've got to reach out to your member of Congress and to their case manager and have them weigh in, with BOP. Do you have advice for families when they feel like?
I think there might be, first of all, I'm fascinated in what you're doing, Joanna, and I wonder, I'd like to know more about it, because it sounds like it's something California could take up, given the progressive legislature that we have. But there might be a way to centralize that, and we might figure it out, because as you and I know, not every member of Congress is going to care at all. And so, but there are many of us that do. And so sometimes it's not necessarily calling your congressperson, but calling a congressperson. And maybe we can figure out a way to collaborate where there's a group of us that could be on call, as opposed to your individual member. Because what can happen in some of these cases is that I might contact the individual member and say, look, I'm following up on this. I understand you're not.
Yeah, well, and I think one thing that happens too, and Joanna, you may address this, is oversight is not a silver bullet either. You can flag problems, but you can't fix them necessarily, right? You can call attention to them. It's just like a, inspector general at the state or federal level that does investigations and identifies problems, but you still need the political will to fix problems. I mean, how has that played out? I mean, do you find that?
I would say for the families who created this office, that's probably their biggest frustration, unfortunately, after the fact that they've relayed to me is that they thought by creating this office that everything would just be fixed. And now that there's an ombuds, all the problems would go away. But unfortunately, as I was just saying, we can point out the problem, but DOC has to ultimately implement it. And if they are not in a if they don't have that process improvement structure in place to be able to implement these changes in a rapid fashion, then it can feel like change is not happening or that change is happening too slowly. So that's definitely a challenge. Ultimately, it is up to the department and it is up to the governor's office to ensure that change happens.
And what would, you've only been at this a little while out in Washington State, and do you see other models in other states? I mean, are other states doing similar things? I mean, I don't see it. I know New Jersey just passed a law recently. I know there's some organizations that have, oversight, not to the extent that you do, but they can get into the prisons, like the John Howard Association in Illinois and Pennsylvania Prison Society in Pennsylvania, but not to the extent that you do. I mean, how many ombuds offices are there like yours in the States?
Yeah.
I don't have a number. I mean, I am part of the United States Ombuds Association, and so I do know that there are a handful. There's, of course, the new one out in Minnesota, and then Indiana has had one for a long time. And then in general, your state ombuds might also have jurisdiction over the jails and over the prisons as well, even if they are specific to the corrections population, which obviously I do think is best. Having a corrections is such a specialized area, and you really have to know what you're talking about to be able to, highlight issues, have good resolution, hold people accountable. And so having that corrections focus is really important. And so I think there's only a handful that are really focused on corrections in the way that this office is.
Yeah, I mean, we've drafted legislation that, for Arizona and Florida at the federal level, and sometimes we get questions that legislators will say, well, oversight's our job, and I see these as complementary. I just think you could be the most aggressive committee, but you're not able to do the same things that a full-time IG is able to do, for instance. And how is your working relationship with lawmakers? Because you present a report, right? So, I mean, let's talk a little bit about that. You do these investigations, and then you present a report to whom? To the governor, to the lawmakers? How does that work?
Well, we could have a whole conversation about the different types of oversight. And as I said, in Ohio, I was part of a legislative oversight group that had pros and cons because you were external from the executive branch. I was, regularly meeting with the legislators, and it brought a different spin to it. Here, now that I'm under the governor's office, the reports that I do are almost, they're for the public, but the expectation is that DOC will have worked with me and will have implemented changes before that report comes out. And so that's the expectation from the governor's office. So that in many ways is obviously very helpful, so that there is that strong push to actually follow through on what I'm recommending. But there's pros and cons to both sides.
Yeah, Representative Bass, I should tell you, your generosity is going to be used, because there are people who have loved ones in Terminal Island that want us to get you their names for your upcoming visit. So we will be in touch with you about that. You may have to visit. Yeah, you may have to visit a few people. I want to, let's see, what else is there? I want to ask about, have you heard about medical issues, Representative Bass? I mean, that is a big thing. One of the questions I posted in our group last night and said, that I was going to have you on is, when I went to prison for a year and a half, and the first thing they told me on the first day was, don't get sick, don't get hurt, because there's just about no medical care. And I saw that to be true. And luckily I wasn't ill. You just knew that, like, playing sports or doing anything you were taking, you're going to put yourself in peril. But COVID has been, it's exploited a lot of things. And the healthcare system is so poor in prison. And, in COVID, when they've had lockdowns, they've closed pill line, so people haven't been able to get their medicine. And there's just almost no way to sort of make that complaint heard, right? Because if a prison does that, it's in some remote area, the family hears about it, and they just feel so lost and helpless about, how do I make this, people, they'll call the warden, they don't get an answer. So there's just a helplessness, and it's not because they're not active. They try everything. I mean, our family members, they have become, professional lobbyists. They call the news media, but what do you do if you have a member who's, is not interested in helping, and a warden who's not responding? I just don't know of any other federal agencies that could get away with this.
Right. So more and more on this call, I'm thinking we need to get a group of us together.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't, if it's a specific congressperson, now they might get mad if I called about somebody in their district, but that's on me. I can handle that. You know what I mean? And I think that there's a group of us that can, and that might be a way of doing it. It just hurts my heart. I mean, I worked in the medical field. I worked at our county hospital. The 13th floor in our county hospital was jail ward, floor 13. And I have seen this, and I know in California, the healthcare was so bad that the courts took over the system. And so I know the quality of care. And if you think about all of the people that are dying on the outside because of poor care, yes, then what the heck do we think is going on in the inside? But it might be a place of unity with the guards. And so I think we have to look for that more and more as well, because that helps my colleagues that are worried about being soft on crime. I mean, to me, again, it drives me crazy because it's about their reelection. It's about the mail and the campaign and them worrying about being soft on crime. It has nothing to do with the concern for human life. And so I'm concerned about that, but there are a fair number of us, though, that do not feel that way. I'm very excited. I mean, of all the years I've been working on this, which, has been a long time, decades, at least now we can raise these issues. Whereas, before you couldn't even raise them. Another one that I worry about when you mentioned healthcare, I also worry about child support, because I know, at least in the state of California, if you don't stop the clock when you go in, you're left with all these bills. It makes it impossible. You essentially have a life sentence. Part of your sentence is served inside, and the rest of it is served outside by all of the things you're blocked from for the rest of your life.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you this, because you brought up tough on crime, and we have a question. And somebody said, we're starting to see some of the releases that, that are being made because of COVID. Either sheriffs are letting people out. What about people say, these people are going to go out and reoffend? We're hearing those arguments already, and some have, because you're not going to have zero risk.
That is going to happen, but I think that we have to, from our side of it, we have to organize and tell all of the other stories, because again, those stories generate votes in some place. Yeah. And the stories of people doing okay and families being united and all of that, nobody hears about that. Yeah. And I think that we need to be, again, I think that's one of the roles FAM has played over the years. And I think, our coordination around that, but getting those stories out there. So the two things in terms of the media, and I say Rachel Maddow because she's focused on it so much, having specific solutions. Yeah. And getting her to, and other ones, obviously, I wish we could get some people on Fox who actually will report on cases where it's okay. Families are reunited, kids are able to see their parents. That part of it is not. Yeah.
Well, we're seeing that, and you're right, we're trying to get that out. Listen, I know your office, you have to leave. I think you're going to have to go vote. So before you.
I'm actually in LA. I have another Zoom call.
Oh, you got another Zoom call. Of course. We're all Zooming all day. I just want to say thank you so much on behalf of all the families that are, going through this mess. It's an incredibly anxious time, and it's great to know somebody's fighting for them and who's in a position to help.
Well, I just want to say it's one of the reasons why I'm in Congress. It's not just a passing issue for me. So thank you so much for your work.
Okay, thanks. Joanna, we always get in trouble because people say, what about states? What about states? And I always, it's funny to me because I always feel like it's like asking somebody like, what's the weather? And it's like, well, where are you? I mean, it's not the same everywhere. And
Right.
people think, well, there's the federal system and then there's the states. Well, there's 50 states plus the district, and so they're not the same, and there's not one answer. But you have the perspective of being in the place that you are, and I guess I would just ask if you could drill down, now that we have a little more time. Some of the questions we've had are things like, I can't believe that we're talking about food. That people are saying to us, and I've seen it, they're sending pictures from the prisons that, whether it's, I don't know if it's because the prisons are shut down or there's not enough staff or what it is, but like the meals are getting skimpier. Some people are getting 2 bologna sandwiches a day. Somebody got an onion for a meal. I mean, do you see that? I mean, is that happening in Washington State or what's happening?
Yeah, unfortunately, the food is a large issue anywhere. It was an issue in Ohio as well. They transitioned to a private vendor, Aramark, that resulted in a lot of problems prior to when I left. I don't know what it's currently like. And then in Washington, food has been a huge concern for the incarcerated and family members. They're looking for healthier food, more fresh produce, more vegetables, and they want better quality protein choices. And right now, COVID, as with everything, it throws it into relief. Actually, it narrows that field because now they're using go-to lunches, or to-go lunches, I should say. And so they're getting these, they call them boats here, but they just get these grab-and-go sandwiches that just transition between peanut butter and jelly one day and bologna the other, and that's what they're getting because they're trying to reduce the number of people in the chow hall at the same time. So it definitely is a concern right now about the quality of food that people are getting, and we don't know how long this is going to last for.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. I mean, I know families are worried that with the shutdown, there's no visits, in-person visits. What do you all offer? Are there things going on with phone calls or video I should say video communications, because they're not visits when it's by video, but what are you able to offer in this time when people can't have in-person visits?
Yeah, Washington DOC, they do utilize JPay and GTL to do phone calls and the video visits, but it is Washington, compared to even other jurisdictions, has just really poor service. They're at the end of their contract. And so unfortunately, it's just the service. I mean, again and again on every single facility phone call, there is complaints about JPay and GTL and the service and poor customer service, and then they can't get a refund. And I've had a phone call with JPay myself just last week, just trying to get some movement there, even though JPay is a private vendor, isn't even technically under my jurisdiction. But it's a real challenge for people right now, and the disconnect from their loved ones is such an emotional toll on the incarcerated population. It's definitely very tough. The one thing I did want to bring up, again, is another action item. Getting an ombuds passed, it took 10 years for the community to make it happen here in Washington, but something that I know you're pushing as well, that I think is an easier lift, are these local family council. The setup, right, that Washington has is that there's a local family council for each prison, and then there's a statewide family council. And so in this time of COVID-19, they've actually, each facility, and this was something that I had actually worked with DOC to encourage them to do, they are doing weekly phone calls. So the superintendent, the warden, what they call the warden here, they will get on the phone with anyone who's on the family council and give them updates about what's happening in the facility. And I think that is tremendous. I know that wasn't happening in Ohio, at least not when I was there, that they didn't have this kind of setup. And so that's definitely something that people could advocate for in this time.
I can imagine Denise Rock, who runs Florida Cares, is hearing that and writing it down right now, because she does these prison talks, after visiting hours on Sundays at the facility with the same thing. We'll invite a lawmaker and have the families be able to gather and talk about concerns. Obviously that can't be done now, but maybe a phone call or something like that. That's also any family member who's listening, that is something it sounds like they can take into their own hands, because a lot of people are finding connections in our group right now, and they're creating Facebook groups of different facilities, and now they could then sort of establish those communities where they might be able then to reach out to the prison. It has struck me as not surprising but frustrating that more DOCs haven't been in touch with the people. I think a lot of the concerns could be addressed if they would just be more transparent. I always feel like they don't want to be transparent, but it allows rumors and things to get worse. And I don't, what is it that makes the wardens or the corrections heads in Washington State do these calls? I mean, they're under no compulsion to do it. They're just doing it because they think they should.
Well, I mean, headquarters told them to, so
Okay.
I think that's probably the answer. But no, I mean, I think there's been challenges to the calls because from the staff perspective, they're tired, they're overwhelmed themselves, and then family members are obviously scared and nervous and bringing up these issues that they're responding to. But I think overall, I would hope anyway that they're seeing the benefit as well to being in touch with the population indirectly and the family members. The other thing that they're doing is that they're having sometimes daily at one of the facilities, but regular meetings with what they call tier representatives that I know also not every prison has, where every facility has a group of locally elected incarcerated individuals for each tier or pod or what have you. And then these meetings are happening internally. That was already in place. Now that COVID-19 has happened, they're having regular meetings with that group as well to also give updates on what's happening. Also not a perfect system. I think, anything, if you talk to the incarcerated here in Washington or to family members here, I'm sure that they would have their concerns about what the information is that's getting out. But I can just say, compared to other states, from what I've seen and what I know, having these in place, at least it is a weekly method of communication that's happening, which is positive.
Yeah, well, I wish more would do that. I want to ask you about, you mentioned how, and I've heard you say this before, you give families a lot of the credit for making the Washington Ombuds office happen. It is a priority for us in all 50 states. And I mean, I should tell people, if you don't know, go to our website and we have an action so that you can write to your lawmakers and tell them you want this. So I would urge you to do that. What did you see? What was successful in Washington State? What were the things that allowed, I mean, because other people would want it, but something happened that enabled it to happen there. What was it?
Well, I think there was, a number of factors. First, the government. I don't want to put partisan politics here to play, but obviously we have Governor Inslee here. We're fortunate to have him, who was willing to make this happen. I don't necessarily see this in some of our, more red states, that they would be as open to this. It does take a lot of courage and bravery to be willing to open up an office that my sole job is to lift up complaints about an executive agency. And so that's a challenge. So we had the right governor in place. We had the right legislature in place that was willing to fund it appropriately, because that's another problem. You can create the office, but if you only have one person for the whole state, they'd be overwhelmed. So you had that commitment. There had been a concern, a very widely publicized concern about releases and some other actions, but predominantly releases out of DOC. So you had this public focus on actions of DOC that also helped drive it. And then again, family members and advocates had already been fighting for this for years. And so all of that sort of came together in this perfect storm, I think, to enable the office to be created and functional, which is not to say it can't be done in other places. And obviously each state, you would need to have your own, the right messaging and the right legislators and the right roles to be able to push this forward. But Washington had a number of things come together to be able to make it happen.
Well, I think I might have jumped over something, and I know more about what you do. So I have two questions. The first is, what how do you interact with families? So, they have a complaint about a loved one who's being denied medical care, or they haven't heard from them in a week because they don't know, and might be disciplinary, or they might have been disciplined in a way that you think is unjust, or they think is unjust. How do you interact? I mean, how do you field those complaints, and then what do you do with them?
So by law, we have a hotline we both staff it with a live person Monday through Thursday, and otherwise it's voicemails. And people can write to us, both incarcerated and family members, so they can, or they can email us if, people email me directly with complaints. So we interact with them by receiving the complaints and trying to go through it. Just first also depends on the time sensitivity and the level of critical nature of the complaint. I'm just giving you an example, if someone was having perhaps a threat to their life, obviously we would treat that much more quickly. So we do have interaction just in our normal run of dealing with complaints and responding to let them know the outcome. For COVID-19, since this happened, at first DOC was not getting as much information out there. And so I instituted a daily phone call with family members that anyone from the public could call into. And that has transitioned. Once the facility started their phone calls, then I transitioned to doing a weekly phone call. So at any point, anyone from the public, family members can call in, hear from us about what's going on, our monitoring visits. I always encourage them to email me if they have any questions or specific complaints. By law, we are required to have quarterly public stakeholder meetings. So those were happening anyway, but those are some of the main ways that I would say that we interact with family members.
And then so their names get shielded essentially, so the families don't worry about that point about repercussions or anything like that.
No, they shouldn't. I mean, to your point, retaliation is real. And because we cannot go in, I always try to be very upfront with people, because I cannot go into DOC system and make any changes myself. We do have to reach out to DOC to say, hey, this was a concern. What can you tell us in response? And so there is that interaction where DOC is aware that someone has made a complaint on this person's behalf. I think in an ideal world, people wish that they could report to an outside entity, and that change could happen without DOC staff ever being involved or know who did what. But unfortunately, that I'm not aware of any system where that's possible. So I'm not aware of or I should say, we do everything we can to protect people from retaliation, but I also want to acknowledge that it is a real thing for people.
And you guys just started, so how close are you to running in a way that you think is most effective? I mean, from the report I saw last year, which I think was your first report, you were still, most of the year still staffing up and building out the network so you could interact with family groups across the state and things like that. So where are you in that process? Because I can tell that, I can imagine, and I worry about this in the states where we're pushing this, is that people are going to think there's immediate, like, things will change.
Exactly.
And there's two reasons why. Well, one, it's going to take a while for you to build, and then second, you don't have authority to change things. You have authority to flag things. And so I how is that playing out? And like, where are you in terms of, I mean, you could probably always use more budget, always use more staff, but where are you in terms of like where the office is supposed to be, and where are you?
Well, ironically, in March, I had finally gotten to the place where I had a full team and our processes in place, and I finally felt like we were really running on all cylinders. And then, of course, COVID-19 happened, and us too, we all had to move to teleworking, and it threw everything into chaos. But so I would say now that we're moving back out into a new normal, I would say that we're in a good spot now. I am so lucky to have a physician on staff, and so we're able to do some of this higher level review of the healthcare complaints. So I feel very blessed with who I have here. And the other thing just to throw out there is that I do center in my hiring decisions people who have been impacted by incarceration. And I think that's very important. And so I want to make sure I name that for anyone else who's on listening to this and thinking about it, both formerly incarcerated people and people whose family members have been impacted by incarceration. And so I think that does two things. For one, I am hopeful that it builds trust with the community, with the family members, that, we are still a government office, and sometimes people don't like, obviously, the decisions that we come to. But the fact that I can say, it's people who are incarcerated, they are unbiased, they are not just rubber stamping DOC. This is an important aspect of this office. So who is here, not just being fully staffed, but who is in this office, I think is really important, and something that I try to make sure is representative of the population that we're serving.
Makes sense. We apparently have people from Washington State watching. Do you have the hotline number that people can call?
Oh, sure. It's 360-664-4749. And our website, which I would hope anyone on this would already know, is oco.wa.gov. And we have flyers up in every housing unit. So the incarcerated should be well aware that we exist and that we're a resource that they can reach out to.
Well, I just know from FAM, it's hard to deal with, there's so many people who have issues, and it's hard to, we're not staffed to help everybody individually. I mean, are you guys overwhelmed, or how does that work?
So we do get a lot of complaints, and that's an ongoing question of capacity, because we do operate within a limited budget, and we do have to prioritize things like health and safety. And so that's what I always try to, every complaint is very important to the person that it impacts. But yes, it is always a challenge when you have so many, and we do have to make tough calls to say, we are sorry that this happened, but if we can't impact change for you, then it may not be something that we can assist with. So yeah, there's always a prioritization, and with all states, unfortunately, right now there's going to be budget cuts, and we're looking at a recession. So this is an especially tough time, both for offices like my own, but that are already created, but even trying to get something started up, it might be an additional lift right now.
Well, we're out of time, and I usually ask people if there's anything that I didn't ask or that I missed that you want to say in closing about, independent oversight and its sort of virtues, or whatever you think. Any topic you want, you can opine on.
Me or someone on the phone?
You. I'm saying before we close, is there anything you want to share?
I will just say how important it is. When I came to Washington, coming from Ohio, which has over double the incarcerated population, I just remember thinking, why am I going to Washington? Why do they need this there? It's Washington, it's progressive. And since being here, every DOC has its issues, its correctional system, right? And so the importance that I've seen in Washington has just made clear to me so much the importance in every single state, because no matter how well your state is running or how well the correctional system is running, unfortunately, it's a business of people, and people make mistakes, and you have some bad apples. And so it is so important to have an ombuds in every state. So I appreciate what you're doing to raise that, and I hope that more of these offices can be created nationwide.
Well, thank you. And I'll just close by saying this. FAM has been for 29 years working on sentencing reform and trying to reduce the number of people who are in prison for these excessive sentences. And some people will think prison oversight is not in and of itself going to reduce the prison population. But there's two issues in my view. And one is that prisons are so warded off, they're so shielded from sort of any sort of oversight or accountability, that until we're able to expose the problems that are in there, our job is going to be harder in reducing the number of people. When we do our Visit a Prison campaign, yes, it's to see conditions and things like that, but it's also to see the people who are there and to realize that not all of these people need to be there, especially for as long as they're serving. So to me, prison oversight ties in completely with the idea that if we're ever going to reduce over-incarceration in this country, you have to be familiar with what's happening in these facilities. And the second thing is, until we get to that day where we reduce the prison population, there are people who are hurting. They're not getting the right medical care. They're struggling inside, and just as importantly, their loved ones are struggling outside and they're not getting information they need. And so that aspect of oversight is really important to us. I think COVID, again, has exacerbated existing problems, but to not know what's happening with your loved one at a time where a deadly disease is sweeping through has made the need for oversight even more urgent. So that's why we're working on it. I don't want the United States to have 2.2 million people in sort of Germany-style prisons. It's not just to make our prisons better and more humane and habitable. It's also to use that, get that camel's nose under the tent to show people who's behind bars, what these sentences are like, so that we can actually take a whack at reducing the population. So I just want to be clear on that. That's why it's such a high priority for us when we're so used to focusing on decarceration. I want to thank Representative Karen Bass so much for joining us. Thank you, Joanna, for all that you do and for being a resource. And with that, we'll talk to everybody soon.